Hello, everybody. I'll just get myself situated here. I'm not in my normal spot because I decided to be professional and sit at my desk. But my cat has decided to take up most of my seat here. So I am struggling to become comfortable around him. Good evening. My name is Grace. Welcome to the Recon. This is the Redress Conversation, where I stream every other Thursday from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And I talk about various things related to housing justice, organizing, and all that kind of fun stuff. If you want to follow along the work that we're doing at the Redress Movement, you can follow us at any of these handles here. That's our Twitter, that's our Instagram, and that is our email, hello@redressmovement.org. If you'd like to get in touch with a digital organizer like myself and get involved in the work that we're doing. I've never done that intro so fast. So good evening, welcome. Happy to have you here. Hope you're having a wonderful Thursday as always. So today, what I thought we could talk about is something very current, very of the time. Sometimes I talk about historical things, but this is literally like news within the past couple days. And it excited me when I saw it because this is work I used to be very heavily involved in. Not in the place we're going to be talking about it. You'll get what I'm talking about. Anyway, so what I wanted to talk about is that a new bill in Albany could potentially create a tenant opportunity to purchase act in New York, which is very exciting because we have the tenant opportunity to purchase act here in Washington, D.C., but it could be introduced in New York, which would be great. So what we're going to do is I'm still torn about. You know what? We're going to start with New York, and then I'm going to give you some context for DC. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. So we're going to have a little bit of a read along today, and yeah, let's just get into it. Let's get into it. Boom. Okay, so it's from Curbed, in case you wanted to know. Okay, so the article is titled, "What if we made it easier for renters to buy their buildings? A new bill in Albany would put them first in line and give them the funding to do it." This is also, I just want to say for the record, as we're going to talk about tenants buying their buildings, one of the things they always talk about is funding, and I'm glad that this article does talk about funding. But that's when I used to do this kind of work that was around building up tenant organizations to buy their buildings. The thing everybody always says is like, the tenants can't afford to buy this building, and I'm like, and I just want to point that out, that if you're thinking that, it's not like they pay out of pocket. It's not like that. They don't have to have like all of the millions of dollars to buy that building. Anyway, let's just get into it. So I hope I pronounced her name right. Viola Straker and her neighbors in her 31-unit Crown Heights building have a proposal to end the years-long standoff over who owns 1074 Eastern Parkway, selling the building to them. Tenants would be better off purchasing instead of selling it to another slumlord, she says. This idea might sound outlandish. Straker lives on Social Security, giving her just enough to pay her stabilized monthly rent of $817, to say nothing of trying to purchase a multifamily building valued at $1.3 million. After her landlord died in 2017 and previous agreements with another company to manage the building fell through, it also needs expensive repairs with leaks, mold, pests everywhere, and a collapsing roof. But what if tenants didn't have to be rich to buy their building? Straker and her neighbors could get enough resources to buy and even fix their building if new legislation passes in Albany. It's called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, also called TOPA, which offers New York residents a number of tools to buy their rental buildings, and it's gaining support in the state legislature after being introduced by State Senator Zelnor Miri and State Assemblywoman Marcela Mitaines. The bill is modeled after the law of the same name that's been in effect since 1980 in Washington, D.C., as well as a 2019 version in San Francisco called the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. In a nutshell, TOPA grants tenants the first right to purchase their building if a landlord lists it or receives a credible offer from another buyer. Tenants can also choose how to purchase a building. They can turn it into a co-op or assign their rights to a new landlord to keep it as a rental building. But that's just the start, because many lenders consider affordable housing to be too risky. New York's TOPA bill would create a pool of funding to help tenants buy their building and staff up housing agencies to help tenants through the process. It would also give tenants as long as 9 months to submit a statement of interest form a tenants association, propose an offer, and secure financing, during which time the landlord wouldn't be able to sell to another party. The goal is to deter speculative flipping and keep buildings in the hands of people who actually call them home. Both Mitanias, who represents Sunset Park, and Zelnor, who represents Crown Heights, say that TOPA would protect their working class constituents from being displaced. A spokesman for Zelnor said, "We're facing a housing crisis and a historical exodus of black people from Brooklyn. TOPA would go a long way towards reversing those trends." Ramon Jacobson has helped tenants finance TOPA purchases for nearly 25 years as director of the DC office of the nonprofit Local Initiative Support Corporation. He's seen it turn around neglected properties and give renters a pathway to home ownership. City stats show that there have been 25 buildings converted under TOPA over the last 5 years. So many landlords are just passive investors, like, my accountant collects payments every month, my property manager fixes it, and they haven't been there for 20 years. When those landlords finally move on, even tenants who have no interest in ownership can sell their purchasing rights to another buyer and get some slice of the pie, he says. But if they decide to buy the building or assign their rights to a nonprofit like LISC to run the building as affordable housing, the tenants get a home where they can bake a whole pie and sit down and eat it. New York's version of TOPA would be stricter than DC's. Tenants wouldn't be able to sell their home ownership rights to anyone, and unlike in DC, where tenants have the option to assign their rights to for-profit developers, New York's version would only allow tenants to assign their rights to a nonprofit or public housing provider. New York's bill also includes an affordability requirement, unlike DC's law, that all future maintenance, rent, and sales prices would need to be affordable to someone making 80% of the area median income. Historically, New York City has created resident-owned housing through the HDFC program, a framework for limited equity co-ops created in the 80s. Back then, the city sold off abandoned and foreclosed buildings for as little as $250 to residents who converted them to co-ops with rules that strictly limited resale profits. Only considered offers from prospective buyers below a certain income. There were obvious benefits to this. Keeping buildings affordable produces good housing. A 2022 LISC report found that New York City multifamily properties receiving affordable subsidies had far fewer maintenance violations than buildings bought by speculators with high levels of debt. But there are far fewer ways to create HDFC co-ops today, says Ariel Hirsch, an organizer with the Urban Homestead Assistance Board, a nonprofit that specializes in these conversions. Much of that is simply because buildings cost a lot more. Tenants trying to buy their own building would have to negotiate with their landlord and secure some financing to not only outbid well-capitalized developers, but also to renovate the building afterward. Then, they would have to find some way to keep their monthly fees affordable while paying off their loans, a daunting task. The chance of success goes up if tenants have 3 things: organization, funding, and a way to stall. That's basically what TOPA tries to provide. Last year, Hirsch helped a group of Bronx tenants purchase their own building who learned some lessons that they think could guide others. The process started in 2017 when their aging rent-stabilized walk-up at 700 East 134th Street was bought by a landlord named James Giddings. Giddings, a commercial landlord who acquired the 21-unit building at a discount after the previous landlord declared bankruptcy, claimed the building had been deregulated and hiked their rents up by as much as $500 despite worsening conditions there. The tenants disputed the increase with the Department of Housing and Community Renewal, but the case languished. In 2019, a housing organizer introduced the residents to Hirsch and the UHAB board, who told them it might be possible to buy their building if the nonprofit helped with funding. But Giddings wouldn't entertain an offer from them, at least not until the pandemic threw the housing market into turmoil and tied up the court cases. That pending DHCR case suddenly became an albatross, said Claudia Waterton, one of the tenant leaders, who has lived in the studio at the Bronx building for nearly 10 years. It was like the one hold we had. No developer could touch it until that case was closed. The delay was like having TOPA rights, an extended time period during which the landlord couldn't find buyers on an open market. That gave UHAB enough time to line up a sizable bridge loan from an anonymous donor, and with the offer in front of him, Giddings finally relented. Last February, the nonprofit officially bought the building on behalf of the tenants for $2.6 million, well below the $4 million Giddings claimed he had paid for it. The process isn't over. Waterton, who worked at the printing company, and her neighbors, who included a chef and a nurse as well as people who were formerly homeless, now have to fix up the building. Hirsch estimates the repairs will cost around $650,000, which means applying for more funding from a hodgepodge of sources, from city grants to the U.S. Department of Energy's weatherization assistance programs. The UHAB also has to replace its bridge loan with permanent financing before it can formally hand over the building to the residents. The goal is to get a HUD loan for affordable housing, but that's been affected by ballooning interest rates. It has not been fun to watch those numbers climb in the last year, says Hirsch. Currently, Waterton pays a monthly rent of $1,050, and the highest rent in the building is $1,550. When they finally converted the building into a co-op, tenants will be able to buy their units for $2,500, and she hopes the monthly fees will remain affordable. We're trying to stay in the $1,250 to $13 something range. We're trying not to go too crazy. All of this would be easier with TOPA, she says. For one, it would have given them the right to redetermine the purchase price through an independent third-party appraisal, something Waterton thinks would have saved them money and brought their price down from the $2.6 million they paid. Even more importantly, TOPA would have given them easier access to financing. The bill's supporters are promising a revolving TOPA acquisition fund to reach $1 billion over the next 4 years. That would be loaned to successful TOPA applicants via community development finance institutions. In that time, the money could convert an estimated 6,800 units to permanently affordable resident-controlled housing, advocates say. By comparison, data from DC's Department of Housing and Community Development shows their TOPA law, with a roughly $112 million revolving fund, has converted 1,928 affordable units over the last 5 years, though many of those conversions also had the help of private financing, says LISC's Jacobson. Housing advocates who have been working with the bill's sponsors are confident that it will be included in the budgets submitted by the State Assembly and State Senate in the coming weeks, though it is not yet clear if the Senate version will include the $1 billion funding request. Would TOPA mean anything without that money? It would establish a really strong right for residents to organize their building, Hirsch says, but she concedes that it would be much harder to do a successful TOPA conversion without the financing. And like DC's law, even the funded version of New York's TOPA would not provide permanent financing. Hirsch imagines residents would have to seek a mix of public and private loans to pay back their initial acquisition loan and make repairs, as the tenants of 700 East 134th are doing. This can be a stumbling block for TOPA conversions, Jacobson says. Buildings often have expensive repair needs after the purchase, and insufficient financing at this stage can leave residents in a kind of limbo. New York's real estate industry is starting to learn about the bill, and most are skeptical, if not disdainful of it. Ann Korchak, the director of Small Property Owners of New York, says, "It sounds like another complicated government operation. It's hard to see how a process like this works." John Stewart, an associate broker at Marcus and Millishap, say the bill doesn't seem practical. Buying a building requires some focus and some guidance. It's not a committee of 20 residents that's going to be nimble enough to buy a building and make decisions. It'd be like herding cats. He's particularly concerned about the time period that TOPA would give tenants to purchase a building. It would make the purchase and sale of buildings grind to a halt, essentially. I'm going to come back to that because I want to finish reading this article, but I'm going to come back to this section. Jay Martin, the executive director of the Community Housing Improvement Program, a landlord organization currently involved in a lawsuit to strike down a 2019 rent stabilization law, says he isn't opposed to TOPA. Adding new buyers to the market is good for someone selling, but thinks the bill would be meaningless if it isn't backed by substantial funding. Like Stewart, he's leery of the time period they'll be given. More than 6 months would be getting a little ridiculous, he says. There's a strong argument to say the valuation of that building could deteriorate during that time. Assuming TOPA makes it into the budget in coming days, it'll be up to Governor Kathy Hochul to decide how to respond. Advocates familiar with the budget negotiations say she's open to it, and that's a good sign. Waterton traveled to Albany last week to testify at a hearing in support of the bill. I want all tenants who are organizing in their buildings like I did to have the same opportunity to purchase their building and take control, she told a panel of legislators. For Straker, the Crown Heights tenant, that would mean finally getting the repairs they need. But she also envisions doing much more, making their building as elegant as the co-op next door. It looks really good. There's a nice garden in the front with roses and nice cobblestones, she says. For the Bronx residents who are in the middle of this process, co-op ownership has already made a difference. Recently, Waterton and her neighbors did something they never would have been able to do previously. They fired their new property manager for being too slow to make repairs. I don't like firing people, but we weren't happy, Waterton says. And the experience was empowering. How many tenants could say they do that? She has a new title too, president of the board. It's a lot of unpaid work, but I love doing it, she says. I'm making a place that not only I can call home, but that my neighbors can call home too. And this is just the start. One day we're going to look back on this and be like, oh, that didn't seem so hard. What a lovely story. Let me go. I want to go back to this paragraph. But I'm gonna circle back to this paragraph in a moment. So what are my initial? So my first initial feeling was that I was actually really excited because I know, for example, that having the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act here in Washington, D.C. is a huge step for the rights of tenants and the power that tenants have. And also it's really huge in the larger conversation about redressing or restitution for a historic lack of Black homeowners being able to purchase homes. It's not a perfect solution, right? But it is, you can own something. I don't want to say you can own something, but it's a way for you to have some semblance of home ownership and therefore more control over your housing, right? So I am a big fan of limited equity co-op development. I'm a big fan of the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So I was very excited to be reading about this in New York, obviously. I want to go back to this paragraph because I think it's really funny. I love this whole, it sounds like it's another complicated government operation. It's hard to see how a process like this works. And the reason I think that that's funny is because I think that is actually a valid way a lot of people feel when they hear about this. I know organizing with tenants who maybe aren't familiar with TOPA, for them, they often feel this way, right? Like, what do you mean we're going to buy this building? Like, that has to be really, really difficult, right? Even with something like TOPA in place. The understandable assumption is that this must be really hard and this must be really complicated. And it's obviously not as easy as just like writing a check and handing it over and buying your building, right? It's not as easy as it may be for like a rich developer to come in and buy your building, but it's not impossible. And it's really the hardest thing is getting your ducks in a row and organizing yourself to do it. And kind of the second part where it says buying a building, this felt very, I don't know if anybody else read this part and felt that this was very like patronizing. Buying a building requires some focus and some guidance. It's not a committee of 20 tenants that's going to be nimble enough to buy a building and make decisions. It'd be like herding cats. I, first of all, found this to be very passive aggressive. Because I was about to say because, and I'm like, because it obviously is. Here's what bothers me about this comment. Where do I start? So buying a building requires some focus and guidance. Is the assumption here that a group of tenants, a group of working class people can't be focused or have guidance? That there's nobody who understands this process and therefore nobody can guide them on it? Because that's not true. And I'm going to get back to that. And then it's not a committee of 20 tenants that's going to be nimble enough to buy a building and make decisions. That's why TOPA gives them the window of time they do. Because yes, it does take more time for a group of 20 people to make a decision than it does one person make a decision to buy a building. But that doesn't mean that their right to own their property where they've been living and paying rent to is not equally as valid as somebody who's coming in and just has a lot of just has a lot of money and wants to buy it. So, okay, and this goes to his later comment, which is that it would make the purchase and sale of buildings grind to a halt, essentially. I'm not seeing the problem. I'm not seeing the issue with that, Stuart. Sorry it's slowed down a little bit. And also, it's not stopping it by years. Like, particularly concerned about the time period, right? It's not stopping it by, it does slow it down, but like, fine. Why should buildings just be able to be turned so quickly? Why should they just, this is arbitrary rules that we're making up here, And also, I've talked about this on many of these other episodes. You've heard me say something similar. It's not a committee of 20 tenants can't just do this. It's like herding cats. What is this organizing erasure that's happening? As if TOPA in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco has never successfully turned a building into a limited equity co-op. Why are we just acting like this is coming out of thin air and there's no context for this and nobody's ever done it and how could tenants do this and this is impossible when it's literally, and what I was about to grab, when it's literally so possible and it has happened so many times. What was the number I read before about how many units were converted to affordable housing just in the past? 1,928 affordable units converted over the last 5 years through TOPA just in Washington, D.C. Stop acting like this is new. Stop acting like people don't get together and make decisions. Stop acting like things can't happen by committee. I won't have it. I really just won't have it. This comment really got me mad. When I heard this first time, I was like, because this is kind of what I was talking about in whatever it was 2 weeks ago in my last episode. It's this organizing erasure, like that you don't have power, that this just can't be done, that this is just impossible, this seems too hard, who would want to do this? And this is all being said by people who don't need this because this doesn't affect them, right? I mean, like, sorry to Stuart, I don't know your particular situation in life, but it doesn't sound like you've ever been concerned about whether or not you would own property. Probably because specifically probably because you are an associate broker at Marcus and Millsap. So it doesn't seem like housing security is maybe an issue for you currently, right? It doesn't even seem like you're probably a renter. You do probably own property. So this is to you like, I don't want to see, I'm making so many assumptions about poor Stuart. But this argument to me sounds like somebody who, it sounds, I'm not saying he's this person, but it sounds similar to me to those kind of people who are like, well, if they just stopped renting apartments and just started putting that into a mortgage, they could own a house, you know? And it's like, you are so far removed from understanding what people's situation is. No, I couldn't just be taking my rent and be putting it into a mortgage and be on my way to home ownership and a debt-free life. Shut up. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that and this, organizing history erasure because like I'm also angry. I get angry about it because in particular there's such a rich history and I think such a nuanced history. I've talked about this book before, but it's this book called Carving Out the Commons, Tenant Organizing and Housing Cooperatives in Washington, D.C. And what's great about this book is that it theorizes about this practice of like the commons and how that would look in an urban setting, but it really is a case study of several different co-ops that existed and either succeeded or failed in Washington, D.C. And it's really fascinating. And the author makes the case, Amanda Huron makes the case in this book, that it's really important for the future of limited equity co-op development, or LECs. It's really important for the future of LECs that we understand how they work and what works really well and what doesn't work really well. So I do also want to read some sections from this book because if TOPA gets passed in New York, which I knock on wood it does, I'm very excited for the future of housing organizing in New York and tenant organizing in particular. And one of the things it talks about in this book was that something that was hard for tenant organizers in the 70s in Washington, D.C., 80s, when TOPA was passed, something that was difficult for them was they were modeling it off of very few examples. They didn't have other examples to model this off of or to see what worked or what didn't. So thankfully, not like Stuart knows this, but thankfully, New York, y'all will have some examples and some successes and some failures to model your LECs off of, which is great. I need more slack on my mic. Sorry. It's just bothering me that I'm like so close to it. So let's read a section. Okay. I'm gonna, because Stuart is the villain today. Stuart is the villain of today's storyline. So I'm just going to read you a section from the introduction that's kind of a story about why this is needed. Okay. It is Christmas Eve, 1977, and the mail carrier is making his rounds through a working-class apartment complex in Washington, D.C. He can't help but notice after a while that he's delivering the exact same letter to every tenant. and he becomes curious, even concerned about the letter's contents. Soon he runs into Sherry, a single mother living with her twin 8-month-old babies in a one-bedroom apartment in the complex. He asks Sherry what's inside the envelope, as Sherry recounts years later. So I said, well, I'll open one. And I did. And I started crying. And he read it. And he started crying. Because he had to deliver them all. The letters were eviction notices. The tenants were being informed that they had to be out of their homes in 90 days. Their entire 8-building complex, home to nearly 100 people, was being evicted to make way for a developer who planned to raise the modest 3-story structures to build tall luxury apartment buildings in their place. Sherry was shocked. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to stay in the neighborhood, Glover Park, which by the way is like 2 minutes from where I live, which was relatively safe and convenient. She had left her old neighborhood after her apartment had been broken into one too many times. Desperately, she tacked flyers to the trees on her block, offering a $50 reward to anybody who could help her find an affordable apartment nearby. The problem facing Sherry and her fellow tenants was part of a larger trend. In the mid-1970s, Washington, D.C. and a handful of other U.S. cities were hit with a newly recognized phenomenon, gentrification. Middle-class residents and investment dollars were returning to certain centrally located historic neighborhoods in cities like D.C., San Francisco, and Boston. With gentrification came the displacement of lower-income residents who could no longer afford the rising rents, or who were being evicted wholesale to make room for new development. In the mid-1970s, stories of displacement in D.C. filled the news. The New York Times told the story of a developer who bought up a string of 13 row houses on a single block in Washington, D.C.'s Adams Morgan neighborhood, evicting all 26 black families who lived there. In 1978, the Washington Post reported evictions in the city jumped nearly 5 times over the previous year. Evictions were everywhere and people were scared. But unbeknownst to Sherry, her neighbors had already started organizing. Ruth was another young woman who lived in the complex. When she received the eviction notice, she recalls feeling devastated. At first, she said, I didn't know what to do, but then I talked to somebody who suggested I try to organize a meeting. So I did, in my apartment, and a lot of people came. And while we were in the meeting, there was a knock on the door, and it was a server who had hand-delivered the same eviction notice. By this time, we were all together. She pauses. It was very interesting. That was the moment where we began to intuit that we were going to have to do this together. For nearly 2 years, the tenants worked together, first to stop the evictions, then to buy the apartment complex collectively themselves. In buying the complex, they had few models to imitate and were mostly making it up as they went along. They knew they wanted control over their own homes and they wanted to remain in place. But they were disturbed by the thought of owning the buildings as condominiums, the very ownership form they saw devouring low-income homes all over the city. So when they finally purchased the building in 1979, they decided to use the limited equity cooperative ownership structure. Under the limited equity co-op model, members paid low amounts for a co-op share and low monthly co-op fees. If they ever moved out, they could sell their share for the same amount for which they bought it, plus a small amount of interest, in order to keep the unit affordable for the next low or moderate income person. In addition, they set aside about 20% of their units for people using federal housing vouchers to pay their co-op fees. We incorporated, Sherry said later, to preserve affordable housing in Glover Park. That was kind of our mission. Other than our co-op, I didn't know of any affordable housing. In Glover Park. Maybe not even in our part of the city. Just as important as the affordability, Ruth emphasizes, was the fact that the co-op members had control over their space and could collectively determine how to run it. What these tenants were doing in the late 1970s Washington was creating a commons. They were taking a resource, housing, that had been used to extract profit for their landlord, and they were reshaping it as a resource that was collectively owned and controlled by the people who lived in it. The purpose of the apartment complex was no longer to serve as an investment vehicle for its owners, but rather to house people who need an affordable, stable place to live. And the tenants were doing this in a capitalist city beset with struggles over land and housing, a place filled with strangers where tenants often did not know one another well and had little proud basis for collective action. They were practicing the urban commons. So one thing I want to point out about limited equity co-ops that this book talks about, it was this line, but it also made me think of another section in this book. The purpose of the apartment complex was no longer to serve as an investment vehicle for its owner, but as a house but rather to house people who need an affordable, stable place to live. That's really important to talk about with limited equity co-ops. And this is the thing that the Stewarts of the world, I'm so sorry, Stewart, but I'm just going to use you as an example. This is something that the Stewarts of the world don't understand. This isn't about owning real estate for profit. You often don't make much money having owned a share of a limited equity co-op and selling it. As it says, you pretty much get back what you paid for it plus a little interest. But it's not about that, and it's also not about the how much you actually, because a lot of times I think it's probably this book. It is this book. It's chapter 3. Sorry. A lot of times it actually seems like in the beginning when you become a LEC, it seems more expensive. But the thing is, what you gain from it and the money you save still over time is more affordable than had you been your building been on the market. Is it this chapter? Might be a different chapter. No, it was definitely this chapter. Sorry. Swear to God, I just saw it too. Also, like, can we talk about for a moment, what I want to talk about, is how is the collective nature of buying this building and turning it into an LEC and saying it's not about us making money off of it individually or even as a collective. It's about providing a roof over people's heads, and it's about making sure people have a place to live that is affordable. And how just like that's such a radical act, and I just think that's really cool. It's gonna bother me. Where was it? I just saw an example of like, okay, well, I can kind of make this example up. But for example, if you're paying, say, because when you buy in, right? So you buy into this was the example I'm thinking of, and I don't know where I read this now, and I'm annoyed. But when you buy into an LEC, it might be, $2,500 to buy your apartment, right? Your unit, when you first get in, and then you have to pay, your dues, right? And your fees, and those dues and those fees may, if you were paying like $800 a month in rent, your dues and your fees may be, it was in this article. It was the one we just read where she said it was like $1,200, right? This is what this was here. Duh. I just saw the font in my head while I was reading it. She said it was going to be like the $1,250 to $1,300-ish range, right? Why am I getting so many emails? Let's find it, shall we? When you command F. Here we go. Okay. So currently she's paying a monthly rent of $1,050, with the highest rent in the building is $1,550. When they finally convert to a co-op, tenants will be able to buy their units for $2,500, and she hopes the monthly fees will remain affordable in the $1,250 to $1,300 something range. So in the beginning, this is also a problem I see that turns out that happens. In the beginning, right, especially if you're this person who's paying a little over $1,000, it's like, now I gotta shell out $2,500 and I'm gonna have to pay $250 more a month. Like, why would I want this, right? Because the advantage to this is you're paying currently maybe $1,000 a month, and you're living in a not great unit or a not great building that's not well upkept, that repairs aren't done on time, that you might have vermin, or you might have leaks, or you might have mold, or you might have asbestos, you might have a lot of problems, right? So you're already paying more than you should, right? And also, so you're paying more because the fees that you're paying are going towards, because you have control over this and you have say over this, the upkeep of the building, right? And improving your building. which otherwise, if those improvements had been made, your rent would not have stayed at $1,500. So even though your rent is going up to $250, it's actually the improvements that would be, had those been made, your rent probably would have gone up higher, and you probably just would have been evicted because the developer who was going to make all of those changes would have kicked y'all out anyway to jack up the price significantly higher because they want to make money hand over fist. So you don't have the same security. So really that increase you're paying is security, right? And it's also all of the other things that might come from that money that you're putting into this pot for the people in this building, right? Which you now have say over. Like, that's the other thing. You were paying this $1,000 to a landlord. You get no control over what he does with that money to this building. You have no say in that. If he wants to, like, repaint the whole building like red with your money, he can just do that, and you can't say shit, and you can't say, hey, I think that's a useless thing to do with this money when I have a stove that doesn't work and I've got mold growing in my bathroom. He can say, well, whatever, I'm doing whatever I want with, because it's my money, because you paid the money to me and I get to do what I want, right? Whereas in a co-op, you have that kind of control, and you have a say in that because it is your money, and you are a part owner of this building, and you have say over what goes into it. So for that reason, I think it's in this book, and I don't know what chapter it is, so I'm not going to try and pull it out. Actually, you know what? I will try and pull it out. Give me one moment. I know it's really early. It's not this chapter. It is... I'm not going to be able to find it, but I found some other things that I want to read instead. But what I was going to find was that there was a story of a woman who was a little bit older, and she just said that, for single mothers, this is very advantageous because oftentimes you can use, like, every tenant organization decides on different things based off of the needs of their tenants, right? So you might say, hey, we're going to create like a child care program within the building, and the money that we get in, we can use to help pay someone who's maybe older in the building to volunteer their time to look after some of the kids in the building, whatever. You can do landscaping. If you want to beautify your building, you can buy materials to make a garden in the back lot of your building. You can, whatever you want to do. A lot of times, obviously, the problem is in the beginning, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to raise the money to buy the building. It's a lot to make all these repairs that you unfortunately often suddenly have to make. It's a lot of you're figuring things out as just a tenant organization that now is trying to own a building. So it's a lot in the beginning, and obviously you're paying those upfront costs. So it's a lot and it's overwhelming, but it's a long-term thing. And I think that was even what was really great was at the end of this article, when she said, like, I think one day we're going to look back on this and say, like, oh, that really wasn't so bad. Like, oh, that didn't seem so hard, right? Like, that is exactly the mentality you have to have, as opposed to every year, every 6 months, you're being kicked out of buildings because the rent went up, or you're being evicted and you have to now find new affordable housing, which is decreasing every year, So, okay, so I'm going to read a little bit of section here about limited equity co-ops. I'm sorry, about TOPA. So TOPA clarified, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, known as TOPA, as part of a comprehensive rental housing conversion and sale act of the 1980s. TOPA clarified tenants' rights to purchase their homes and also gave them leverage if they wished to make choices at the time their landlord sold. Under TOPA, tenants could accept a buyout to leave the building, negotiated to stay for an affordable or reduced rent, purchase their homes, assign their right to purchase to a third party, or negotiate for still other options. Significantly, however, the law required owners to give tenants the opportunity to purchase at a price and terms that represented a bona fide offer of sale, which meant that tenants had to pay what were essentially market rates for their homes. Tenants may have gained the right to purchase the housing, but without the financial assistance, low-income tenants had no way to exercise that right. The city addressed this dilemma by providing low-cost financing to low-income tenant associations to help with purchase. In exchange for receiving the financing, typically a low or zero-interest loan, Cooperatives were required to remain limited equity for the life of the loan. With this financing, even very low-income tenants could purchase their homes. While condominium ownership would require individual residents to qualify for individual mortgages, the limited equity cooperative structure enabled tenant households to participate in a collective or blanket mortgage, and tenants typically were able to buy into the co-op for $800 to $1,500. Though tenants could use TOPA to exercise a range of options, the law encouraged tenants to choose LECs by providing stronger negotiating rights for tenants who chose that option. By 1980, just 5 years after the city's first elected government in 100 years had come to power, groundbreaking legislation had been passed that gave tenants the legal and financial framework to stay in place. It sounded like my neighbor just dropped a bocce ball on the floor. The city... Or was it? Groundbreaking legislation had been passed that gave tenants the legal and financial framework for staying in place as their buildings were sold off. The city government, because of consistent pressuring from tenant activists, had created a structure for enabling the creation of commons. I'm going to keep going in this section. So this is one longtime DC organizer of LECs talking about how these are part of the civil rights struggle. DC was a center of the civil rights movement. In fact, probably DC had a large number of folks who were in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And when I think of the civil rights movement, that's what I think of, live in DC. So I would expect that some of the principles that they were involved in organizing below the Mason-Dixon line, which includes here but even further south, around voting rights, around voting, around cooperatives. You know, one of the leaders, the founder of SNCC, Ella Jo Baker, was a leader in cooperatives. And Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, which was one of our civil rights leaders, or human rights leaders, was very much involved in cooperatives in Mississippi. So a lot of those folks were involved in collectivism. Which I also just want to say, again, back to Stewart. We act like there is not a long history of cooperative development. We act like there's not a long history of collectivism, which there is a deep and rich history of Black collectivist work, predominantly done by Black women, that I won't have the erasure of in 2023, but I digress. For this organizer and others, community control over land was a critical piece of a larger civil rights struggle. Land was the economic basis for life and for freedom from white supremacist control over Black labor. In the urban context, control over land became control over housing. DC tenants were so eager to purchase their buildings and convert them into cooperatives that even before the final version of TOPA law passed, they began organizing for collective ownership. Pop off. Limited equity cooperatives grew at a rapid clip in every quadrant of the city. From late 1979 to late 1980, low-income tenants created 17 LECs comprising 1,000 units. As of November 1980, 20 more tenants associations were in the process of negotiating to buy their buildings, for a total of 2,000 more units. Tenants of the Jeffrey Terrace apartments in the southeast quadrant of the city purchased 67 units in 1979 and named their new LEC the People's Co-op. A group in the Northwest Shaw neighborhood bought a 4-building complex comprising of 51 units in 1980. Some of the tenants that lived in the complex since the turn of the 20th century, and they were, the Tenants Association's president declared, determined not to be displaced. By 1981, around 50 buildings containing nearly 6,000 units had been reclaimed from the investment-driven real estate market and converted into limited equity co-ops. It was a heady time for LECs, and tenant leaders, most of whom were low-income African-American women, received some glowing press coverage. In the late 1980, Washington Post reporter LaBarbara Bowman described the experience of co-op formation in detail. This is the quote. Armed with only the law, these Black women, many of whom only high school educations, found lawyers and organizations to help them unite tenants and arrange the complicated procedure of financing the acquisition and rehabilitation of the buildings. They had fought frustration, apathy, and indifference among tenants who worked as janitors, cooks, clerks, and others who either are retired or on public assistance. People who never have owned property and never dreamed that they ever could. They have spent long hours baking pies and cakes, frying chicken, cooking dinners, organizing cabarets and trips to raise money needed to help pay engineers and make down payments. And they have learned about their rights, contracts, and financing. While developers and more affluent tenants have converted more than 9,000 apartment units to condominiums, low-income tenants are converting to cooperatives where individual tenants buy stock in their building, which entitles them to a unit. Their more affluent counterparts look forward to their buildings increasing dramatically in value to push up sale prices, but these poorer tenants have written bylaws to limit the appreciation on their properties. With appreciation curbed, sale prices will remain relatively low, and a core of housing will be preserved in a city for those earning less than $20,000 a year in 1980. In a city where housing costs have spiraled ever upward and condominium conversion was rampant, the work of these tenants, mostly black, mostly women, was helping to keep housing within reach for low-income residents. So I don't want to hear about how it's hurting cats and how this seems too hard when there was a history of black low-income women doing this work and doing it well and converting thousands of units to affordable housing. I don't want to hear it, Stuart. I just don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. And you can be mad at me. I'm so sorry to this poor man, Stuart. I've really just attacked him. I'm not attacking the other person who said this seems like a hard government program. I'm not attacking her. What was her name? What was it? Anne? I'm not in the section, am I? What was her name? The Herdy Cats? Yeah, I'm not attacking Anne. I don't know why. I'm just Stuart has really stood out to me. I get a cease and desist from Stuart. That would be so funny. I'm so sorry. And okay, I'm gonna read one more section. I really like this book. If you can't tell, I really like this book. In DC, as noted earlier, LECs have faced some opposition on the grounds that they do not allow their members to build significant wealth. Because most low-income people in the city in recent decades have been African American, this argument has been about race as much as class. Why support a homeownership structure for low-income people, the argument goes, if it does not allow them access to what is assumed to be the most important function of homeownership, wealth? As one African-American DC co-op expert told me, when he first learned about the LEC ownership structure years ago, he thought it sounded like something a bunch of white people thought up to keep black people poor. He is not alone in this perspective. After witnessing the benefits of LECs, however, he changed his mind and became a proponent of the LEC ownership form. Home ownership in the U.S. society is so bound up with the promise of future exchange value of one's home that it can be difficult to conceive of a form of ownership that is not commodified, or why this form of ownership might be valuable. But low-income tenants faced with the imminent crisis of losing their homes may have a different perspective on home ownership than do people examining the question of the comfort of a middle-class position. Stewart. Previous research indicates that at the time they gained control of their housing, LEC members were not typically thinking in terms of the future exchange value of their homes, as Kolodny and Gellerman found in the early study of LECs in New York City. Ownership in and of itself is not the major attraction of the conversion formula. The tenant's main interest is gaining control over their residential circumstance in order to improve them. Control over the conditions of their housing for those new co-op members was more important than traditional homeownership, which the authors equate to the right to sell on the market. Other research on New York City's LECs suggests that, by taking over their building through purchasing them collectively, tenants are subverting the traditional ideology of homeownership. Tenants, Clark finds, use the ideology of homeownership to convince the city that they should be allowed to buy their buildings. Promoted as providing homeownership, cooperatives could be presented as socially and politically desirable, although the meaning of ownership in that context was very unlike its traditional meaning. Cooperative residents view ownership as a source of political legitimacy, secure tenure, collective control, and permanent low-income housing. They do not view it as a commodity from which they may profit or as a symbol of individualization. My research finds that LEC members understand ownership as Clark's respondents did. Contra Kolodny and Gellerman, ownership in fact was a main attraction for tenants who were looking to convert their buildings to LECs. But the purpose of ownership for most of my respondents was not to gain the ability to sell their unit on the market, which is how Kolodny and Gellerman seem to be conceiving of ownership. Tenants who worked very hard on collectively purchasing the building were not focused on turning their homes into commodities. Far from it. They were interested in transforming what had been the commodity of rental housing into a space over which they had control. And they were very interested in becoming owners and felt like owners, even if ownership did not include the right to sell their unit on the market. I want to see if I want to read this next quote. And then she takes a quote from somebody who was part of a cooperative and saying how proud she was as an owner. and she says the fact that you were going to own something that you didn't have the opportunity before. Blacks were afraid to go to the banks. Blacks were afraid that they were not going to be able to qualify for a loan and that sort of thing. You didn't have to go to a bank. All you had to do was fill out the paper. It was a nice feeling, and you were able to own something without having to go through all the government paperwork and being afraid that you weren't going to get a loan and all of that. So I think that made people more willing to act as a team because they knew collectively they could get the loan. So I think that's all we're going to read because we're getting close on time. But what I think is really important here when we talk about TOPA, when we talk about LECs, and I know I've kind of gone in a tangent about LECs, limited equity co-ops, because I think they're really cool and important. But when we talk about this is that it's very easy to fall into this narrative of my friend Stuart here that's like, how are all these people going to make this? You could never get a group of tenants to buy a building, which is very like insulting to renters' intelligence, which feels racist a little bit. It's not, but it just feels, one of those things that's like, it's not inherently racist, but it kind of feels racist. It certainly feels classist. I think that's kind of fair. But it feels a little racist. When we talk about that, what we're actually doing is erasing not only a very deep history of tenant organizing and purchasing buildings in Washington, D.C., hello, and I don't know about San Francisco at all, but hello, Washington, D.C. since the 70s, but we're also erasing a very deep history of Black women and collectivist organizing. So that I really don't appreciate, Stuart. There's another book that you could read in depth about that history, which is Collective Courage, which you can look up. It's also a fantastic book. And again, it's like, stop acting like this doesn't happen. Stop acting like this is too hard and like we haven't been out here. So that is my rant. I will be keeping my fingers crossed for you, New York. I will be thinking of you. I will be hoping that this passes for you. And I will be very excited what the fuck you do with it when it does pass. Because as I was just reading in Carving Out the Commons, when TOPA was put into law in Washington in the 70s, there was this huge uptick. And I hope that we see the same thing happen in New York when it's passed. We just see this huge wave of tenants buying their buildings. That would be so cool to watch. And if you want to do it and you want to talk to me about it, please email me. You know where to find me. You can find me over here at hello@redressmovement.org. You can also find me on our social medias down here. If you hit my DMs or tweet at me, I will definitely talk to you. I'd love to get to see what you're doing. But that's really all I have. That's really all I have for this evening. This has been the Recon, the Redress Conversation. My name's Grace. I'm a digital organizer at the Redress Movement. I do this every other Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I generally talk about housing justice, things that I think are interesting or fun, and also usually related to organizing things that I think the people need to know. I'm all here. What am I trying to say? I'm just here trying to give you the power to make choices about controlling your own lives. That was kind of what I was trying to say. And I would like to see TOPA just like enacted on a federal level. I really it doesn't need to be cities. This could be federal legislation. Sound off. I didn't have a question of the day, but sound off if you're in a city that you think needs a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. Sound off in the comments. I want to hear from you. I want you to tell me where you're watching from and why you're like, this needs to happen here ASAP. So anyway, thank you for joining me, or thank you for watching after the fact. If you're not following us on our social media channels, please do. And that's all I have. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I will see you back here in 2 weeks. Good night, everybody.